Welcome to Meadowlarkers 60. It has already been decided that our honorary captain is Chuck Bednarik. And if Howard is listening to this, there's a chance I said that last name wrong, and I'm hoping that he corrects me next week. But for now, Meadowlarkers 60, and I'm Kate Fagan, your host. No Amin today, no Howard. It is going to be me and Meg Linehan from The Athletic, senior writer, covering all kinds of things. But here today and relevant today is soccer. And Meg has been on before about a month ago or so, Meg. So thanks for you're a recurring guest now on the Meadowlarkers.
No, you just can't get rid of me at this point.
That's right. Nor would I want to. Before we get started on the NWSL and pro soccer, I wanted to get a little bit of your perspective on Grant Wahl, who recently passed. He was on Meadowlarkers a few weeks ago from Qatar, as he it was his 8th World Cup. And I know you knew him. And the one thing that I think, Chris Whittingham shared his stories on football. And I wanted your perspective specifically when it came to Grant on his position in women's soccer, maybe how he helped you personally, or more so how you saw him approach covering the women's game.
Yeah, I mean, there is probably my job doesn't exist without Grant kind of pushing the coverage forward. Obviously, he had multiple cover stories, right? Like going back to the 99 Women's World Cup. So I think, we're in such a weird space still, I think, in the sport where there are now four and a half of us maybe that actually cover this sport full time in this country, right? It didn't exist as a full-time women's soccer only position until I started at The Athletic in 2019. And I don't think that doesn't happen without Grant existing in the space and showing that there was a path for soccer coverage in general, but then also treating the women's game like it was an actual thing and valid of its own coverage and its own discussion, and treating it the same way as the men's game. But yeah, I mean, I think it all goes back to, I think the game that I finally met Grant in person was a game in Frisco, Texas, of all places, in 2014, like January 2014, and him having like no idea really, I think, what a lot of us were doing to cover women's soccer. I paid out of pocket to go on that trip and to cover that game, right? There was no one's paying us to do this for a really long time. And trying to kind of explain that. And then obviously, having 8-9 years to kind of build that relationship. And I think have him support. I mean, one of the first people who reached out to me after all the NWSL reporting at the tail end of 2021 was Grant, getting both me and Molly Hensley Clancy on the podcast together and putting us in conversation and really trying to highlight that work. So, I think Grant was really someone who was fully aware of what his boosting of work could do for people, and knowing that we're not all kind of like on our own little islands, that we all do depend on each other in this space. So I think it is, I do keep thinking, I stood next to him in basically every single mix zone in France for the 2019 World Cup. And we always joked it's because, well, A, he was really tall, but B, like, the players always came to him, right? And so if you wanted one of those big players, like, the best spot that you could put yourself was next to Grant. And so it really was like when he rolled down into the mix zone, it was kind of a scramble. And so it is really hard to imagine the next year and having another World Cup year, right? And knowing that he's not going to be there with us in New Zealand, that still is something that I can't wrap my brain around in the slightest.
Yeah. But even so, he was on Meadowlarkers, it was 3 weeks ago now. And I remember I was thinking about this even before hearing the news from Qatar. I was thinking about how in the middle of that podcast, I just asked him a question. I asked him how many World Cups had he covered.
Yeah.
And I, at the time, even though I quite obviously care about women's sports, do a lot of writing to try to like explain the ways in which we talk about women's sports that hinder it and all of that different stuff. I asked him this question, how many World Cups had he covered, thinking that only men played the World Cup, like in this moment, right? Like I didn't say how many men's World Cups have you covered. I didn't say how many women's. I said World Cups and I only meant men's. And he responded by saying, well, I've covered 3 women's World Cups and 5 men's World Cups.
Yep.
And that whole next week, I was like, wow, that one, it's like in my own mind, he wasn't calling me out, but in my own mind, I was like, wow, I still have my own work to do about like the language I use. But he very clearly was not going to answer that question without sharing the breadth of his coverage across genders.
Right.
And I just, any more you can share about like how you saw him treat the women's game, not as like, okay, it's like this side thing I'm doing when the men aren't playing, but like truly understanding his role in it and elevating it.
Yeah, I think there's still a much bigger conversation about getting the media coverage, right, of women's sports up into this kind of bigger, like that's how we grow the game, right? And I think I gave Grant my fair share of, like needling to be like, hey, why aren't you out here at like Gotham games on a weekly basis, right? Like we're all hauling ourselves out here. But I think there's also kind of the sense of having to know when, his role was obviously so much bigger than just NWSL and US Women's National. He's trying to like cover an
He's going to
entire
Argentina and writing like a Messi profile too,
yeah,
right?
he's doing global coverage, right? Which is so different than what so many of the rest of us are doing. And I think that's why it's so important. I think a conversation we've had many times over the years is we're still in the process of building out this infrastructure of covering women's sports. And you need people kind of up at this top, big enterprise writing, world traveling, like going and finding the big stories that people aren't really equipped to do right at the moment. And you also need the people who are in their markets or covering the NWSL. Like we need all of this. And I think it's really the thing that Grant really did well is knowing that, okay, I'm at the top end of this and doing something very different than everyone else, but I have to highlight all this other work that is being done because that's how the whole thing actually, like, this is how we get the game to survive in this country and grow in this country, is if people know, okay, like, yeah, sure, I'm going to Argentina or Qatar to do these bigger stories, but also there are people in these markets telling the day-to-day stories that then, we need this whole tapestry of coverage, and we particularly need it on the women's side. Like my own role has changed since that first game in 2014, right? Compared to what I do now in terms of trying to do more feature writing, trying to do more investigate. Like I still have to do the day-to-day because like we haven't built that infrastructure really yet, but that's where this whole project is really trending. And so I think Grant knowing all of this stuff has to work, and the people who have that big platform, who have been there the whole time, there's room for everybody up here. And if I can highlight the work that is good and is contributing wherever it is, that's how we all succeed. It's not just on one of us.
Yeah, I know, one small thing was when we launched Off the Looking Glass, Jess Matana and I, within 5 minutes of like putting out our first like trailer, Grant had retweeted it.
Yeah.
Because it was about women's sports. And I don't think like listeners might not understand that there aren't a lot of like major sports journalists with male sports journalists with hundreds of thousands of followers who are regularly retweeting women's sports coverage. Like it may seem like a small thing, but for some reason people often seem to like parcel out their retweets as if they're like a commodity, like a commodity in shortage. So and I think this dovetails with why we're here today to talk about the continuation of the NWSL story, because like last time we talked about this, I think we touched on briefly how much like media coverage on the day-to-day basis is one piece of how you keep something like the NWSL. I mean, the breadth of the scandal and all of that. Like that is one piece of how you keep that from happening. There's certainly other pillars, but
it's a big part of it, of just people being around and realizing when something is going, like sometimes it is that simple.
Yep. You see a coach's exchange at the end of practice and you're like, that's a little odd.
Yeah.
And they just stockpile before you start asking the player. Like it's simple stuff like that that keeps that might stop this in 2018 instead of whenever it's happening. But just to set the table for listeners, certainly some will have listened a few weeks ago, but some might be coming to this fresh. Will you take us through the timeline of the story we're talking about, and also what this most recent NWSL sort of, what do we call it, white paper or
report?
Whatever.
Yeah,
Report.
we've just been, it does get confusing because there are both like reports coming out of investigations proper, and then there's also investigative reporting that has happened. So
Right.
we're kind of still all over the place in terms of terminology. But I mean, this really all goes back to 2021 across the NWSL, multiple head coaches departing the league because of alleged behavior, but reporting from me at The Athletic about former head coach Paul Riley, who was then with North Carolina Courage, but previously had been with Portland Thorns, and the attempts to report his behavior and the failures of the league to not address this. But also Molly Hensley Clancy at the Washington Post did a number of stories too about Washington Spirit, Chicago Red Stars, got some other details on head coaches. So there was this sense of there is a systemic problem happening across the NWSL with, abusive behavior in a number of ways. And some of it, my story was primarily about sexual coercion and verbal abuse. Verbal abuse was really present in the Washington Spirit. I mean, but we've now seen there's a whole number of things that were really happening. The other big chunk too is that players have been trying to report this behavior in some form or another, basically since the league started, and the league has never addressed it. The teams, the league, the manager of the league, US Soccer. So now, as of December, we've gotten 2 independent, mostly, investigations. The one that we last talked about, Sally Yates, was commissioned by US Soccer. She focused on 3 teams primarily and had a whole bunch of systemic recommendations. And then the one that just came out this month was led by Covington and Burling, which is a law firm that was hired by the league itself to do an independent investigation. And then it was then joined by Wahl, who was counsel for the Players Association of the NWSL. So it is a little different because the players they have skin in the game in this one. They have a representative in the room helping with this investigation and making sure that the players' viewpoint is, kind of embedded into the entire process. And so another giant report, to your point, detailing both these same 3 head coaches really who have been the focus of everything, but then really going, it's honestly, it's organized by behavior, really, more than coach or team. So, we've seen verbal abuse, sexual harassment, but weight shaming was a big theme of this report. So there's really still a lot to dig into. And then also, again, the institutional failure to not handle reporting well. So a lot.
Yeah, a lot. Just a reporting question from your perspective. When you released the story at The Athletic and while you were working on it, did you predict, or did you have a set of expectations about how big this was going to be and how much it was going to snowball? And we're talking, right, the Yates report, now the NWSL / the PA report. I mean, this is one of the biggest, most long-reaching stories that is going to have a huge institutional, and I want to talk about the word institutional in a minute, don't let me forget. But did you think, I know this is big, where has your perspective been on what has actually transpired in the last year and a half?
I think the really helpful perspective for me, because obviously I'm coming out of women's soccer. I'm not an investigative writer. I'm a person who really liked women's soccer and started writing about it, right? Like, this was not something that I had thought I was ever going to be doing. But Katie Strang at The Athletic, who is, I mean, honestly, like, if I get a phone call from Katie Strang and I'm in a position of power, like, I am probably going to be scared. Like, that is kind of, Katie's role now. But she is like our lead investigative writer and has done so much incredible work. And she was so instructive to me, both from a process point of view, but also like the emotional point of view. But we were talking that day and she was like, Meg, I have never seen any reaction like this. Like, even in the first 24 hours, right, where we were getting all of this fallout. But then yeah, to be here over a year later, right? And having two giant reports and still, we've got two teams in the NWSL up for sale as part of this. Like, I think we knew that there were going to be kind of these big earth-shattering developments, but I think in terms of like scale and just how much has had to change, and like we knew it had to change, but I think not quite. I think there's a lot of resistance to doing this work. If it were any other sport, would we see a reaction like this? I don't really know.
Yeah. I mean, some of the fuel being that like a lot of these U.S. women's national team players have massive platforms to talk about this. But I don't think it's hyperbolic, and please correct me if I'm wrong, to say that this has had a global effect to some degree, because the NWSL, if I'm the Premier League and I'm working with women's teams in the Premier League, I'm probably looking at the NWSL, seeing some of these structural issues, seeing the reports come out, and hopefully in a positive way taking note of them. I don't know. I mean, I'm not believing that there's a lot of people that are just like proactively making the lives of women's sports, female athletes, better. But I do think you'd think there'd be one eye on it from other
You
global
would hope,
destinations.
and I
Yeah.
think that was kind of one of the themes of player commentary, right? I mean, I think one of the big organizations that if people are looking to this global picture, FIFPro, which is the overall union that oversees unions across the globe, right? So I think they have a very vested interest in this. And I think we have seen, the players from Venezuela had a big sort of statement after the original report. So we have seen some of this. I think there's a lot of work to be done on multiple fronts, but yeah, to your point, like I sure would hope that over in England, they're looking at this and saying, okay, what safeguarding stuff are they putting into place? And what should we be copying? So that way we don't have this problem over here. Because I mean, I think the real theme from the players is like, it's not just us, and we know it's not just us,
Yeah.
right? Like, I think we have seen it play out, not just in women's soccer, but you think about gymnastics, right? Swimming, like we have seen it play out time and time again. And we know it's not just a women's professional soccer problem by any stretch of the imagination. So how do you learn from everything that has happened over the last year, especially now we've got all these documents, we have all these recommendations? There should be a path for other people to copy it. It's just a matter of, are they willing to make the investment that's going to be required? And that is a big, fun women's
Yeah.
sports question all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess I'm naive, and I got myself caught there. It's not as if I think like men running Premier League teams are thinking, we might have some structural issues. Let me
Yeah.
put a better harassment policy in place. What I think might be happening, because you see this repeat, is that there are other athletes who see this
Mm-hmm.
story and they're like, oh, yeah, my coach also treats us,
Right.
or I thought I had to be silent, but I'm like taking a page out of some of
Right.
these American players' books and having that kind of, spiral effect or contagion effect.
Yeah, I mean, I
But
think that's the hope. I think it's also been the hope for the equal pay fight, right?
yeah,
Of And we have seen that start to play. I mean, Scotland right at the moment is considering legal action, the women's national team, against their own federation. So I think there is hopefully that kind of contagion effect to your point, but I don't there's still so many barriers to people speaking up, right? And I think
yeah,
we've only just started to unpack a lot of that here in the US. Like, we're still getting players who are only now feeling comfortable telling their stories to these investigation teams, really, and saying like, now I feel like I might actually be protected if I
yeah.
give you my name.
Okay, so I'm curious in your thoughts about this, because I think even going back, you know, 4 or 5 years, I can think of any number of stories. But of course, USA Gymnastics comes to mind. Some of college scandals that you see, of like even like the Rick Pitino, certain
Mm-hmm.
behavior patterns. You When I was on ESPN, I remember, you're having a conversation about it on whatever program, and you're trying to shy away from thinking this is a Rick Pitino problem, to talk larger about the thing you said earlier, like, and this was also in the NWSL report, or this idea of like failures in institutional structures, or like cultural and systemic dynamics. Now, I know what these are, and we could talk about them, and I think it's important to talk about them so it doesn't sound like jargon. But I eventually got to a place where I was like, how many more times can I say institutional
Yeah.
failure?
Yeah.
And also this thing that is so nebulous. Like, how do you fix something that's so nebulous? So when somebody says like institutional failure now, or when we're talking about the NWSL story, institutional failure, I know you can take us through what that means, but like it also feels it can feel unfixable because it feels
Right.
like I don't know how do you fix an institutional failure? So yeah,
Yeah.
what's your reaction to kind of all of that?
I mean, I think like I was on a Zoom with Cindy Parlow-Cone, president of US Soccer, former NWSL coach, former US Women's National Team player, right? Mana Shim, who was one of the players who spoke in the original Paul Riley story, who is now heading up one of their task forces on participant safety. And then Daniel Slayton, who is a former national team player, potential like in a potential ownership group for
Yep.
NWSL.
Yeah.
Who is in charge of implementing the recommendations from the Yates report because she's a board member of US Soccer as well. So you have like these three very competent human beings, right, who are in charge of, to your point, this huge like Daniel Slayton has very specific tasks. Mana is in charge of a task force that has to kind of consider this giant cultural overhaul. And one of the actual things that they want to do is change how they approve coaches here in the US because US Soccer is also in charge of coaching licensing. So they want to change it from a red flag system where if you screw up or you're a terrible human, you get the red flag and you're out of the system, to a green flag approach. So instead of trying to remove bad apples, they're actually trying to screen everyone and reward the people who do well and remove the bad apples. And that, like, when they're trying to walk through how this, and like the number of coaches, right, from every single level of the sport, I mean, this is such a massive undertaking.
Because you're
And
not talking about the X number of NWSL
no,
coaches. You're talking about youth coaches
I'm
down to like the
talking
9 and
every
under
single
level.
coach
Yeah.
who is licensed in this, like technically I have a US soccer F license, which doesn't even exist anymore, right? Like the most basic level of coaching license you can do online. And to be fair, it's, you know, there are big like conversations we could be having about how coaching licensing works in this country, but like this is a massive number of people. And so to kind of like, but that is the level of project that, at least on the US soccer side, they are trying to figure out, okay, how do we make these massive overhauls to how we have built the entire system that our sport relies on? That's the level of conversation that they're having. And so, yeah, I mean, it
That's
is like,
structural. That's
yeah,
yeah.
that is structural, but it is, I mean, and there's so many different parts of it too, is because it's not just coaching licensing. You're talking about governance, you're talking about reporting mechanisms, right? Like there's all this other very specific stuff that needs to change in addition to the American approach to sports, which is, you know, like our own kind of collective psychology project of how we interact with sports in this country and winning at all costs, and like if we work really hard, right, like all that kind of stuff. So there's all that has to happen, but then there are actual like legitimate giant structural changes that are in the works that I can barely wrap my head around. So it, you know, this is not a short-term project by
Yeah.
any sense.
So instead of getting overwhelmed by like the whole apple, let's take like one little bite of it here
Yeah.
on the NWSL expansion with the news coming out that there's what is it, three
Potential.
cities. And you mentioned Danielle Slayton, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of being part of that like 4-tiered ownership group, possibly in the Bay Area.
Right.
So you got Tampa Bay Area, Boston. Now, from what your knowledge is there new mechanisms in place to approve a new NWSL franchise? Like and also this is two-pronged because it's like, is Angel City the new model of like how you should build a team? So one, they should be, because ownership seems to be a huge issue with this NWSL systemic issue.
Mm-hmm.
So are there new mechanisms in place as far as you know for approving ownership and for an NWSL franchise? And then also, are all three cities that we're talking about sort of mimicking the Angel City model?
Yeah, I mean, we don't. Tampa Bay is, like an MLB owner, right? Boston, we don't really have a lot of information about this group at all. We think it is Linda Henry, right, from FSG and a few other folk, but like we don't really know a huge amount about this bid.
Mhm.
Bay Area has been the group that has kind of gone public and made a sales pitch, right? Like I spoke on the phone to Daniel Slayton and Leslie Osborne, and I obviously talked to Allie Wagner and Brandy Chastain a lot. Like you have this kind of core group of former players who have looked at Angel City and said, okay, we see that. We want to do it with our own kind of spin. So to your first question, are there new mechanisms for expansion? Not that we know of yet, but I do expect that we're going to see a very different expectation moving forward, because one of the really defining characteristics of this league has always been the internal politics of its owners and how they form the board of governors and kind of the political alliances of this board of governors. So Angel City, San Diego, Kansas City, Washington Spirit, like we have seen this kind of new little power unit form, and they are all fairly deep pockets, and they want to make money, right? This is not kind of that old school 2013 of like, well, we got to survive, we got to make it to year 3. Like those days are gone, right? So now the big question is, you have 3 potential expansion markets. Utah is also hanging out because they have an into the league after the team had to be relocated following an owner being ousted because of racist and sexist language, Deloy Hansen, right? So that's still in the mix too. But you also now have 2 teams for sale the same time all of this is happening. And those 2 markets are on the complete opposite end of where like NWSL teams are, because you have Portland, the shining jewel of this league, right? Coming off a championship win, having just lost their head coach who resigned because of going through an investigation, being cleared, but losing the locker room. There's a lot happening in Portland, but they are, in theory, potentially the only profitable team in the NWSL, but built-in fan base, right? Like, again, this amazing jewel of the NWSL. And then you have the Chicago Red Stars, who are just kind of in this free fall right at the moment. Arnhem Whistler has cleared the way for a sale, but they don't have a good venue, right? SeatGeek Stadium out in, like, it's not in Chicago, it's in Bridgeview. It is miserable to get to. The attendance is really bad. They're losing players from free agency, right? Like there's a lot going on, but the expectations are still going to be this kind of high price tag, because now there's a lot of money incoming into this league, right? And the valuations have really skyrocketed since the last takeover, essentially, right? Which was in the $4 or $5 million category. And now we're in the $40 million.
Why? I was reading that and I'm like, what? I mean, is it because Angel City has set a model in Portland, and so it's
Angel
like
City is
annual
a
potential?
factor.
Yeah.
Angel City is a factor, but really it was because of the battle over the ownership for Washington Spirit. So Michelle Kang comes in, spends a lot of money for what is essentially a coup of that ownership group, in a good way, right? In a good way. But there is now this kind of basement where the expectations are going to be minimum 35 million, but we've also seen these valuations going up, and I think a lot of that comes from, we know that there is a media rights deal kind of hanging out at the end of this year. And you look at the media rights deals for US soccer, but particularly MLS, and there's going to be an expectation that the payday is finally here for NWSL. No more like, oh, we're going to give you $1.5 million and also you have to produce your games. Like, there's going to be this kind of like giant leap forward for media rights. And I think we have seen in every other league, right, that is more advanced, that is your number one source of revenue, is media rights. Right at the moment, that is not the case for NWSL, and it needs to get fixed. But the number that they are hoping comes in, they're just kind of like waiting for that payday. So that's going to be a factor both in the sale of Portland and Chicago, but then also what those final values for an expansion team are. So it's a really weird and interesting time from a business point of view for the NWSL.
Yeah, I talk a lot on this podcast and also on Off the Looking Glass about the WNBA TV rights deal coming up and whatever it is. I've been like stalking it for 6 years on a countdown, maybe not quite that long, maybe like 4 years, but because I think, like you said, we can have all of these other markers, like the big one being the MLS and Apple, and we can say, what was that, 10 years, 2.5 billion.
Yep.
And we can look at the numbers and say, well, the MLS's TV audience is very comparable to the WNBA, but we also know the history of women's sports, and we don't think people are going to value women the same way they value men. So it's like, no matter what kind of algorithm you put together to say the WNBA deal should be worth this, it's going to be really interesting to me to see what it's actually worth, what somebody will actually pay for it, for a lot of reasons. Just being like, oh, women earn X on the dollar. There it is right there. But so the question in there is, when is the NWSL deal up? What are the metrics that are in play that you know of about, TV attendance, all of that? Is there some gauge of what kind of dollar figure they're looking at?
I mean, I think they're basing probably numbers off of MLS, also because they're looking at MLS and saying like, hey, whenever we get a game on CB, like we're blowing some numbers up, right? They almost hit 1 million viewers for the NWSL championship. I think for me, the really interesting thing is, and this is a bigger sports issue overall, is how do you balance growing the game via access, right? / the payday that you probably get if you put your product behind a paywall on something like Apple TV, or, I mean, right at the moment, the deal is kind of a mixed bag, I think, for NWSL, because they get these kind of one-off games on CBS, but most of the games are behind a paywall on Paramount Plus. So you're able to get these like big, like jaw-dropping numbers for NWSL, especially compared to the history of pro soccer for the women here in the US, but you're not building off of that, right? There's no like, okay, I know if I tune in on CBS on Friday night, I'm going to get an NWSL
no
game
continuity. Yeah.
Right. And so that is a really big thing that I think we're all looking for, is like where that decision goes. Because I think the hope is that you do still have stuff that lives on linear TV just to try to continue to grow, especially in a World Cup year, right?
Yeah.
The CBS gets this exclusive negotiating period because they currently have domestic rights. International rights are now also going to be up for grabs. So it really, like, it's now negotiation time for the NWSL, 100%.
Yeah, go ahead.
But I mean, in terms of financials, I mean, I think, we're not going to see 2.5 billion for the NWSL. I don't think anybody's expecting that. But I think one of the big questions is how many years do they aim for? Because I think the NWSL is probably going to want at least some security, but also knowing, okay, we probably want to renegotiate in maybe 5 years, right? Because it's going to give us a better chance to like drive up the value again.
If you believe in your product, you don't want a 20-year deal. You want to say, we're going to outperform expectations, and then renegotiate.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think the hope is, if you look at kind of, MLS also has more teams, right? But if you divide that deal by number of MLS teams and then you apply it to 12, maybe 14 teams in the NWSL, what does that maybe get you? And so can you get maybe like, I don't know, 10 million a year? Like, I think it's going to be kind of a huge jump.
Yeah.
But the struggle is going to be, can you maybe get 50 to 75 million for 5 years out of someone? And I don't know if that answer is going to be yes. Like, I just truly don't. But I think coming off of a world, like we're going to have World Cup numbers again to go off of. I think that number for the championship is going to be one that they really drive home with a lot of people. But we don't have any visibility to CBS SN, the sports network, right? We don't have any visibility to really what the numbers with Paramount Plus are. But there is the belief in the product, but also there are significant issues with broadcasts as they stand right now in terms of quality that are going to need to be fixed as part of the next deal too.
Yeah. Yeah. 'Cause, I mean, this may seem like it's tangential to the NWSL report, but when we were talking about like pillars of why this has happened, one of them, and you alluded to it, like one of them is treating like women's sports like charity, which then the next step in treating it like a charity is the ability to tell your players this league is going to fold because it's only existing by our good graces.
Yeah,
Therefore, if something bad is happening to you, be quiet. So it's like getting money in and treating it like a business. It also helps with what we're talking about with these systemic issues.
100%. And I think I mean, I do think that people should read both reports, but that was such a theme, I think, across both. But I think the NWSL joint investigation report did such a good job of kind of laying that groundwork, because the way that they spell out that section is players were basically told to be grateful, right? Which is a real theme that I think we all kind of know in this space, but grateful, loyal, and acquiescent, which I thought was such a good word choice of just like, all of this is so baked in that like your career is on the line, your team is on the line, and the league is on the line. And so few of us, like, I'm not out here thinking like, oh, if I complain about something, the entire athletic is going to fold, right? Like that's not a thought process I deal with on a regular basis. And so I think just kind of understanding that mindset that players were in for so long and the things that they had to do in order to justify playing and extending their playing careers, like that's the stuff that, yeah, when we're talking about TV money and attendance and just the presentation of the game, like all of this is where that larger landscape really does play into how we got to this particular moment.
Yeah. And you mentioned presentation of the game, and you can take that plenty of ways, but it makes me think about like let's take, for example, ESPN's deal for the WNBA. And no matter what the dollar figure is, unless it's some astronomical figure that's like golden handcuffs, but if it's what it actually was, right? Like let's say, 20 million at various points going upward, then you get to the question of the presentation of the game. One being, are you actually presenting the games? Are on your air, are you presenting them? And the answer for ESPN has been kinda, a little bit. And then it's what can you do to build out people's understanding of the characters and storylines that exist within this league? I mean, you may not know the answer to this, but when it comes to the NWSL, this is a factor across sports, especially in women's sports, is great. You're putting the games on air, but no one's going to know who those people are unless they seek them out on their own. And not many of us do that. So
no one's even going to know where the games are unless they seek it out on their own. Like that's the other struggle too. Like we're not even at like, can you build, pregame, postgame shows, like all of the kind of stuff that we get with men's sports that we just take for granted. Can people find the games? And right at the moment, the people stepping in on the NWSL level are sponsors trying to help. I mean, you think about what Ally did around the championship. They got the championship moved to primetime by literally just being like, CBS, here's a bag full of cash. You got to put on at 8 p.m. You got to move it to primetime. And then we're going to run ads all over Washington, D.C. Like you could not turn around without seeing an Ally ad about the NWSL championship.
Megan, it worked. It worked. People tuned in. Amazing. Wait,
like what a concept.
When you let people know where something's going to be, then they find it. It's crazy how that works.
I know. It's just, like you apply logic to a situation and suddenly things happen.
But as far as the NWSL and this decision and what they need, it's like right now they've got earlier hurdles than when can they have their version of First Take, right? Like there are
do we want First Take, right? Like I think that's also the, to go back to our conversation about Grant Wahl, right? Like, are we reinventing all the same sort of stuff that we have around men's sports that maybe adds value, maybe doesn't? Like, do I want to be shouted at for half an hour about, I don't know, Sophia Smith versus Mal Pugh? Not really. Like, I'm not interested in that. Maybe other people are, but I think that's been one of the benefits of building this out of nothing, right? And as a labor of love, is we can say like, what stories and like what narratives do we need here that give us value? And some of that is 100% like, we don't have, trying to report a trade in the NWSL is like you're teeth are being pulled while someone is also hitting your kneecaps with a hammer, because literally everyone in this league is so paranoid about information going anywhere, whereas you have a whole economy of knowledge in every other sport, and people aren't afraid of it, right? And you're driving interest by like hot stove talk, right? Free agency, I mean, this has been a complaint of mine trying to write about free agency in the NWSL. We have no transparency about player salaries, about salary caps, where teams are at in this. Like, you can't say, oh, this player should go to this team, because you don't have any of the pieces of information. You can say like, oh,
Right.
Dabina should go to Gotham. That would be super fun. That's all you can write.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, you know, a base, like, I think this is a very base level human attribute. And I think back about like growing up with trading cards and like trading baseball cards in the 80s and 90s, like that, to me, it scratches a very fundamental, almost childhood itch in the sports world of like hypothesizing trades,
right,
and understanding kind of like the mechanisms of how your team is built. It's like Legos times baseball cards. Like no sports league should be without these things. Regardless of, I agree with you. Like we should have you back on to talk about at length how women's sports can in the future can continue to build itself without just replicating the male sports model, which you see at the NCAA, which you see at all of the levels. But we'll shelve that for today. But like these base level things of like Legos times trading cards, like
right.
These things drive. So anyway, if you want to jump in there, do it. But otherwise, I wanted to get your sense of like pulling this back out to the global piece. Is we've talked a lot about the NWSL here on Meadowlarkers, but I don't, and I know about the Premier League because I see U.S. soccer players going to play for Tottenham or Arsenal. But what would you say are the 3 to 4 leagues across the world that are the best right now?
This is a great question. I mean, the NWSL is in this conversation, right? Almost despite itself. And there is going to be, I think, a real struggle over the next couple of years to stay in that conversation of being the best league. And NWSL has, I think, something that a lot of other leagues don't, which is this parity, right? And I think that has been the hallmark of this league of, I think about the way that the NWSL season ended this year, where Gotham, the last place team, had this crazy 3-3 draw with Portland, the team that went on to win the championship, right? Like, there is this sense that every team can hang on any given week. And it was just pure chaos in a good way on the field this year. But you think about England, Spain, France, Sweden, I think, has historically been in that conversation, Germany as well. But like Mexico, right at the moment, like if you want to watch an up and coming league, I think Mexico is really the spot where a lot of us are looking and thinking like they're going to have a really, really competitive product really soon. And they are getting big crowds, and I think they have a lot of the benefits of having the system of men's teams are they have their women's team, right? So like you get that kind of instant loyalty built in, which is not the case in the NWSL, right? But is the case in pretty much every other league, where you have this overall club, right? So if you're a Manchester City supporter, you can be a Manchester City men's, women's, under 22, whatever it is. Like you just kind of like you're automatically spoken for. That's not the case in the NWSL, except in a couple of markets.
Let me pause you real quick. Do you think that is a benefit to the NWSL, long term, short term? I feel like it could be bad short term, good long term.
I think there's pros and cons to it, but I think we've seen England is going to be, I think, such a massive factor moving forward, both on the international stage but also on the domestic stage, because we're going to have explosive growth in that league following their Euros win. Like that is their 99 World Cup, essentially, right? But in a better spot, because like the infrastructure of the sport is so completely different to where we were post 99 World Cup.
And they have the ability to turn around to the 2023 World Cup, like within 1 year or 2 years, right? Like to like create, because if they won the 2023 World Cup, I think like England would just be like,
oh yeah, it's just like to the moon, right? But one of the big things that I think the NWSL is going to have to eventually figure out how to do this. And I think we've gotten away with it here for about a decade, and those days might be over, but every other league is on the normal European calendar. So they're playing, through the winter, right? That's really hard to do here, especially like when we're thinking about potential expansion spots. Like Boston is back on this list. We're not going to play through the winter in Boston, but every other league is going to have such an advantage because they're going to be locked in with the overall FIFA calendar, right? So the NWSL plays through the World Cup, plays through the Olympics. I don't understand why. Like, we just took a whole break for the Men's World Cup, Premier League pause, right? Because the product gets diluted. Like, you're losing all of these players to the Men's World Cup. You're never going to play games. But because of the way the calendar works here, for the NWSL, they feel forced to.
Yeah.
And so that's going to be a really big challenge. And that's why I think we're going to see more players staying in Europe, but also potentially American players going over to Europe because you've got Champions League, you've got this nice friendly calendar, right? Where you don't have struggles getting out for FIFA dates. But yeah, England, I think France is going to be really interesting to watch because I think there are major kind of sexist and structural things happening there too, right? But the men's league is also in this very weird and interesting position in terms of their media rights and money and all this kind of stuff. But I mean, England and Mexico, I think, are the two that we're all kind of watching and being like, this is going to be the challenge, right? The marketplace is going to be more crowded, and that is a good thing. But the NWSL can't just like skate by anymore and say we're the best league in the world, because that is it's been like despite itself for 10 years.
Is there can the NWSL get in the Champions League?
No. But I mean,
no way.
One of the things that just got announced by FIFA.
I'm sorry, not the Champions League. No, the Champions League is when like the winner of the
it's French a UEFA competition.
But because it's European, we can't get in it.
Well, Champions League is its own little fun thing, but FIFA did just announce, this is the other challenge, right? The calendar is getting more crowded because now there is this idea of a Club World Cup. So we would have top European, Asian, American, South American clubs all coming together for what could be this amazing competition. And I think fundamentally we have needed a Club World Cup on the women's side because it's going to grow the domestic game, which has really been, FIFA has been like, oh yeah, we want World Cups every 2 years to help grow women's soccer, which doesn't do what they think it will. It makes them a lot of money, maybe short term,
dilutes
but
it
not.
Though.
We'll set that aside, but you need to grow the club game, right? And you need to grow the investment in the club game, and a Club World Cup helps do that. But what we have seen globally in women's soccer is that, first of all, there's a massive rash of injuries happening. Like, we have seen the number of ACLs that have blown over the past calendar year have just been truly absurd. And players are getting like heavily loaded and sometimes, and then like not getting any games at all.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to like, this is going to be the big challenge of, as more competitions get added, how do we protect players, just from like a health point of view, but how, like, this I think is going to be, maybe it's not the major existential question facing the NWSL, but I think it is one of them in terms of actual like quality of the league and attracting and retaining top international talent. Is how do you exist on this very European favorable international schedule when you want to play through the summer and you think all your money is going to be made in the summer, but also the games are really miserable because who wants to be playing in Houston at 5 p.m. in 100% humidity in July?
And I also think in the early days of this next phase of the NWSL, if this next inflection point coming off of your article in 2021, I mean, as somebody who's a casual club fan, I'm a bigger fan of international soccer. There's a baked in storyline for me of the Portland Thorns playing Arsenal for some sort of club. Like, I don't need to know nitty gritty things. I can just say, oh, Portland won the NWSL and now we're playing an English club. I'm obviously rooting for Portland in this
Right.
global competition. Like
Right.
you need some of those. But
Yeah.
before I let you go, is there, when we're looking ahead to 2023 Women's World Cup, New Zealand and Australia, coming off of the NWSL report, the Yates report, just the emotional tax that this is put on, and maybe this is a stretch, this question, but do you see any sort of implications for the U.S. team as a whole and how it might affect them heading into this next, critical World Cup?
I think the overall hope is that players can just focus on playing this upcoming year, right? Like that is the hope. And I think we did really see a big emotional impact from the Sally Yates report back in October. I mean, I was joking about this with one of my editors yesterday. Like the U.S. women's national team went on a 3-game losing streak, which for them is so unimaginable that it was like the major headline of this year of they lost 3 times in a row to England, Spain, and Germany. Like that doesn't happen. It hadn't happened since the 90s, right? And trying to divorce those 3 losses from the context of, well, the Sally Yates report had just come out, right? Also, to be fair, they weren't that bad in the England. Like there was one loss in there that was like legitimately concerning, and the other 2 were kind of like if they had happened in a normal time, we would have been like, it's fine, whatever. But I mean, that is, I think it's always going to have to be in the back of our heads, right? But fundamentally, and I this has been kind of my number one wish for 2023, the players have done so much. Like the players have done so much. It is someone else's turn to start fixing things and to start being the adults in the room, right? And to actually look out for their best interests so that way they can actually play. Just play and like do what they're supposed to be doing and not do all of these other like major tasks for the growth of the league or the growth of like just let them play. And that's it's still TBD, right? But they have 2, like we have a new collective bargaining agreement in the NWSL. We have the new collective bargaining agreement for the U.S. women's national team that guaranteed equal pay. Like a lot of the groundwork has been laid in terms of like that actual work that they really did have to do. So now I think the hope is, and a lot of this stuff just be set to the side for everyone, not just national team players, but for everyone, and just let them focus on playing. That's like, it's my hope. I can't guarantee it, but that's kind of, I think, the big question ahead.
All right, I think that's a good place to leave it. Meg Linehan, I'm Kate Fagan. Thank you for joining us on Meadowlarkers 60.